The first time Basin 2 alarmed, I was standing in the control room at Red Mesa water treatment plant outside Grand Junction, Colorado, staring at a black camera feed where the Basin should have been. It was my first night on security, a little after 1:10 a.m., and that alarm had a sharp, flat sound that got under my skin fast. I stepped out onto the Basin deck anyway. Cold wind cut across the railing hard enough to make my eyes water. The floodlights turned the concrete white, but the water below stayed dark, not just shadowed, dark in a way that felt deliberate. I remember stopping right there, and knowing that if I leaned over and looked down, that would count as something. That was when I understood why some rules get said out loud. I drove out to Red Mesa just after sunset in my old Chevy, the heater rattling and giving me maybe half of what I kept turning the dial for. Once you got far enough outside Grand Junction, the road stopped feeling connected to anything. There were still lights behind me, but they thinned out fast. Then it was just frontage road, scrubland, low warehouse buildings set back from the asphalt, and long strips of dark in between. Red Mesa sat out past all that behind chain-link fence and a locked gate, lit up in pieces instead of all at once. A couple floodlights, a glow from the office windows. The rest of it just sat there low and flat against the land like it had been built first and forgotten second. I kept telling myself it was fine. It was a small municipal plant. It was security. Walk the perimeter, check the gates, log the doors, stay awake. I'd done worse jobs than that. I'd done colder ones too. That was what I told myself while I turned into the access road and watched dust kick up pale in the headlights. Walter had called me maybe 10 minutes earlier, right when I was getting off the main road. "You already left?" Walter asked. "I'm at work," I told him. He took a second. "Right. You said that." He didn't sound scared. That almost made it worse. If he'd sounded scared, I would have had something clean to react to. Instead, he just sounded a little turned around, like he'd walked into the middle of his own evening and lost the thread. That had been happening more lately. Little slips at first, then bigger ones. Asking the same thing twice, standing in the kitchen with the cabinet open like he was waiting for the room to explain itself. I'd started leaving notes where he'd see them without thinking. Coffee's in the blue tin, pills after breakfast, I'm at work, back in the morning. I hated how fast I'd gotten used to doing that. I also needed the job. That part was simple. Rent was still rent. Groceries were still groceries. The power bill didn't care how tired I was, and neither did the pharmacy. I'd been stringing things together for too long by then, day labor, temp shifts, whatever came up fast enough to matter. Red Mesa had called back quick. They needed nights covered. I needed a paycheck that showed up when it was supposed to. That was enough for me to say yes before I had time to think too hard about whether I wanted to spend my nights alone at a water treatment plant outside town. Nicole Ramsey was in the office when I came in. She looked like she'd been there a while and still had another hour left in her without liking it. Mid-30s maybe. Pulled back hair. Utility jacket zipped up halfway. She gave me a quick look, then slid the sign-in sheet across the counter. "You here for nights?" Nicole asked. "Yeah," I said. "Security." That was pretty much the whole exchange. She pointed me where to sign, where to leave the key ring if I ever got reassigned off overnights, and which radio was mine for the shift. No spooky tone, no strange pause, no weird warning tucked into the handoff. Just ordinary work talk in an office that smelled faintly like old coffee and printer heat. That normal part stuck with me more than it should have. The paperwork was normal. The fluorescent lights were normal. The cheap office chair with a split seam in the vinyl was normal. Even the hum from the monitor wall behind the desk was normal, in the way all tired equipment sounds normal if you've worked enough places like that. It was everything past the glass that felt off. From inside the office, Red Mesa looked bigger than it had from the road, not taller, just wider in a way that made the dark between things feel farther than it should have been. Concrete basins sat low under the lights. Metal railings cut straight lines through all that open space. Beyond them, there was fence, brush, and black ground going flat into the night. No traffic noise, no neighborhood sounds, just wind now and then, and the kind of distant mechanical hum that was easy to ignore if you wanted to pretend you were somewhere less empty. Nothing on paper was wrong. That was the part I kept coming back to later. If you'd handed me a clipboard and asked what looked unusual when I first got there, I wouldn't have had much to give you. The gate worked, the office was staffed, the radios charged, the monitor wall was live. It should have felt like any other low-level night job. Instead, it felt like a place built for people to work in during the day and get out of before dark, and nobody had bothered telling payroll that. Stan Rourke met me in the control room a few minutes after Nicole sent me through. He was older, late 50s maybe, with a kind of face that looked worn in by weather, bad sleep, and years of not wasting words. He had a plant jacket on over a thermal shirt, a badge clipped low, and a coffee cup that looked like it had been riding with him since before sunset. Nothing about him said dramatic. If anything, he looked like a man who'd spent too much of his life around pumps and panels to be impressed by much of anything. "It's a small plant," Stan said. "Feels bigger at night." That turned out to be true. He showed me the monitor wall first, then the logbook, then the root board with the rounds marked out in dry erase. The setup was simple enough on paper. I was there to make the perimeter checks, test the gate locks, walk the fence line, check the doors on the outbuildings, and keep an eye on the camera feeds between rounds. If anything looked off, I logged the time, called it in, and stayed with the problem long enough to know whether it was real or just equipment acting up. There were enough cameras to cover the important access points, but not enough to make me feel like the place watched itself. The blind spots mattered. Stan made that clear without saying it outright. He looked at the monitor wall. You keep your rounds on time, you log your doors, and you don't freelance. That part I liked, or thought I did. Gates, locks, timestamps, a route that repeated itself. I could do a job like that. I needed a job like that. There was something almost calming about seeing the whole shift broken down into squares and check marks. Walk this stretch, check that door, sign this line. I'd been spending too much of my life lately dealing with things that didn't hold still long enough to name. Walter was one of them. Some days he was mostly himself, just slower. Other days I'd come home and find him standing in the hallway with that blank pause on his face, like the house had changed shape while he was sitting in it. I kept telling myself it wasn't time yet. Not for a home. Not for outside help I couldn't pay for anyway. Not for the kind of decision that felt like giving something up for good. A shift with rules and times on a board felt better than thinking about that. Stan took me out through the side door and walked me around the site. Up close, Red Mesa was laid out like a place built by practical people for daylight use. Low concrete basins, utility buildings with metal doors and painted numbers, piping runs, safety railings, gravel paths and patches of old asphalt. There wasn't much wasted space, but there was still enough distance between structures that, once the wind got moving, the dark in between them felt deeper than it should have. He pointed out the main office and control room first, then the basin deck, then the west fence line stretching past a run of scrub and hard dirt toward the chlorine shed. The shed itself was small and square and plain enough to look boring in daylight. At night it sat by itself under a pole light with a locked chain on the handle, the kind of building nobody wanted to spend time inside if they didn't have to. Beyond that was the filter gallery, older than the rest by the look of it, with narrow windows and a wall-mounted intercom box by the service door. The paint on the box had yellowed with age. The cord looked newer than the housing, like somebody had replaced just enough of it to keep it in use. Then there was the lower pump house. That one sat farther down than I expected, set off a sloping access path where the ground dipped away from the rest of the site. You couldn't see much of it from the office side. Just the roofline, a security light over the door, and part of the railing near the steps if you stood in the right spot. "Anybody else out here after midnight?" I asked. "Not if things are working," he said. He didn't say it like a joke. He didn't say it like a warning either, just flat. A fact with the edges sanded off from being repeated too many times. That was what bothered me. If he'd tried to spook me, I could have filed him under old guy messes with the new hire. But Stan never seemed interested in my reaction. He was just handing over a place. We passed Basin 2 on the way back toward the office side. It looked like the other basins, same concrete lip, same railing, same black water catching light in the wrong places. If there was anything special about it, I couldn't see it then. Still, Stan's eyes touched it and moved on faster than they had with the others. Not enough to call out, enough to notice. That kept happening in little ways. He checked the lock on the filter gallery door himself, even though I was right there. He glanced toward the lower pump house, but didn't linger. He never stood with his back fully turned to the Basin side when we were outside. None of it was dramatic, just small habits. But small habits are usually where the truth lives with people who have been doing a job too long to talk much about it. By the time we got back into the control room, I had a radio clipped at my hip, a key ring heavier than I wanted in my jacket pocket, and a decent idea of what the shift was supposed to look like. The route made sense. The duties made sense. Even the isolation made a certain kind of sense. A plant like that didn't need a crowd at night. It needed one person who stayed awake and did exactly what the board said. I told myself that was me. And I meant it too. That's the part that still gets to me. I wasn't walking into that shift looking for trouble or half expecting some story to come true. I was trying to get through one night of honest work, keep a roof over my head, keep Walter in his own house a little longer, and prove to myself I still had enough control over my life to hold one steady thing in place. Red Mesa looked like it could be that thing if I kept my head down and did the job right. It almost looked simple. By the time we got back into the control room, Stan had already shifted into the part of the night where he was mentally halfway out the door. He checked the board again, looked over the monitor wall, took a drink from his coffee, then opened the logbook and ran a finger down the last completed line like he was making sure the page itself hadn't changed while we were outside. The room still felt ordinary. That mattered. The overhead lights buzzed a little. One of the monitors had a faint color bleed in the upper corner. The HVAC kicked on and pushed out air that smelled like dust and old wiring. There was a stack of forms clipped together by the printer, a stain on the desk somebody had stopped trying to scrub out, and a half-dead pen rolling near the keyboard tray. It looked like every control room I'd ever been in, a place built around small tasks and long hours. Nothing in it looked like the setup for anything I should have remembered for the rest of my life. Stan wrote something in the log, capped his pen, then folded the sheet once before setting it down. Stan folded the log sheet once. "There's a night list," he said. I didn't say anything. I think I just looked at him. "Not in the book," he said. "Still matters." He said it flat. No pause for effect. No little smile to see how I'd take it. That was what made me stay quiet. If he'd sounded embarrassed saying it, I probably would have let myself off the hook and treated the whole thing like some old plant superstition workers passed around to keep themselves awake. But Stan didn't sound embarrassed. He sounded like a man who'd gotten tired of deciding whether something deserved to be called stupid before following it anyway. He kept his eyes on the monitor wall. "If Basin 2 alarms after 1:10, don't look down into the water." That one landed harder than it should have, mostly because of how cleanly he said it. Not if the pump pressure drops, not if the panel throws a fault, not if something splashes or moves. Just don't look down. He said it like there was no useful discussion hiding underneath it. He shifted his coffee cup an inch to the left. "If you hear your name from the lower pump house after midnight, don't answer and don't go down there alone. There are things a person can laugh off easier when they come wrapped in extra words. Stan didn't give me that. He just laid them out one after the other like locations on a route card. Basin 2, lower pump house, times attached, conditions attached. He wasn't making up creepy ideas on the spot. That was obvious pretty quick. He was reciting something. He tapped the desk once with one finger. West fence at 2:30. 6 lights. If you see 7, turn back. That was the first one that almost lost me. Not because it was the strangest, just because it was the one that sounded the most like the kind of thing a guy starts believing after too many graveyard shifts and not enough sleep. Count the lights. If there's one extra, walk away. It sounded like somebody letting their nerves build a ritual out of a bad angle and a tired brain. I remember thinking that if he'd started with that one, instead of Basin 2, I might not have listened as hard to the rest. Then he gave me the next one, and that feeling went away. If the filter gallery intercom says the name of somebody you love, you leave, and you lock the door. That was the one that sat wrong. Not loud wrong, not movie wrong. Just wrong in a way that got under my ribs because it crossed a line nothing in a normal job should ever get close to. Gates, locks, cameras, fine. Even the basin and the pump house I could force into some category in my head. Mechanical issue, night crew rumor, somebody screwing around. But the moment he said that about the intercom, the room changed a little for me. Not around the edges, in my head. Because that wasn't a rule built around equipment. That was a rule built around knowing exactly what would make a person stop and listen. He left it there for a second. I didn't ask anything. I didn't want to sound stupid, and I didn't want to sound like I took it seriously either. So I just stood there, with my hand resting on the back of the chair, feeling the fake leather split seam under my fingers, waiting for him to either walk it back or give me something that made it less bad. He didn't do either. At 3:17, if intake rises with every gate still closed, stay in the control room and don't open that door for anybody. That one pulled all the others tighter somehow. Up until then, I could still pretend these were a handful of weird one-offs from an older guy who'd worked too many quiet nights alone. But that last one had a shape to it, a sequence, a thing to do and not do. A clear point where the safest place in the plant stopped being the whole plant and narrowed down to one room and one closed door. I looked at the control room door without meaning to. It was just a metal door with a push bar and a wired glass panel beside it. The kind of door I wouldn't have noticed 5 minutes earlier. Now I was noticing the scrape marks near the latch plate and the way the weather strip didn't sit flush in one corner. Stan didn't add anything after that. No, you'll see. No story about the last guy. No explanation for where the list came from or who started it or what exactly he thought was supposed to happen if I ignored him. He just stood there with that same tired face and that same coffee cup and let the air in the room stay exactly as normal as it had been before he started. That made it worse, too. If he'd started giving me lore, I could have checked out. If he'd acted like he was passing down some grand secret, I could have written him off as one of those men who need every old workplace to turn mythic before they retire. Instead, he said the rules the same way he'd pointed out the radio charger and the lock on the chlorine shed, like they belonged to the shift whether I liked it or not. I told myself there had to be ordinary versions of all of it. Basin 2 could have had a bad sensor. Sound might have carried wrong from the lower pump house. Maybe the rest came from old equipment and too many tired people working nights too long. I didn't need the explanations to be good. I just needed them to be normal enough to hold on to. The truth was, I didn't buy the rules, not fully, but I didn't dismiss them either. That was the shift in me right there. I still thought the one about the west fence light sounded ridiculous. I still thought the intercom one crossed over from strange into flat out wrong. But I no longer thought Stan was messing with me. I no longer thought I was hearing the private hobby horse of an old utility worker losing his edge. The list felt older than him, used, worn down by repetition, not official, but not new. He slid the logbook toward me after that and told me where he wanted the timestamps written on first rounds. We moved on. At least on the surface we did. He showed me where they kept spare batteries, which exterior camera liked to fuzz out in cold weather, how hard I had to pull the west gate before the latch fully caught. Job stuff, real stuff. But the room never quite settled all the way back down for me after the list, because now the plant had two versions in my head. There was the one on paper, keys, panels, pumps, rounds, logs. Then there was the one Stan had just handed me without asking if I wanted it. The version with places that changed after certain hours. The version where hearing your own name might mean something you were supposed to ignore. The version where a locked room could become the only place you had left if the night started going bad in the right order. I remember standing there pretending to listen to him explain the incident for him, while my eyes kept flicking to the monitor wall, then to the door, then back to the wall again. That was the point where Red Mesa stopped feeling like a job site I was learning and started feeling like a place that had already decided what kind of night it was going to be. It stayed quiet for a while after Stan left. Quiet enough that I started doing what people always do in jobs like that once the handoff is over and the other person's taillights are gone. I started settling in. I checked the monitor wall again, flipped through the logbook, made sure I knew which key went to which exterior door, and walked one short inside loop just to burn off that feeling of still being new in a place. The control room had that stale overnight smell every utility building gets after midnight. Old coffee, warm electronics, dust in the vents. Outside, the wind had eased off some. The whole place felt flatter without Stan in it. That helped for maybe 20 minutes. Then, the Basin 2 pressure alarm went off. It wasn't loud in the way a fire alarm is loud. It was thinner than that, sharper. The kind of sound that gets under your skin because it doesn't belong anywhere except the exact place it's happening. I looked up right away at the monitor wall, and the feed for Basin 2 was black. Not frozen, not snowing, just black. Every other camera was still there. Fence line, office exterior, service gate, lower pump house. The Basin feed was the only one gone. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, like the picture might decide to come back if I waited it out. It didn't. The alarm kept sounding in that flat, needling rhythm, and my body did what it was supposed to do. I got up to go check it. That was the part I understood later. It wasn't just that something was wrong at Basin 2. It was that the way to deal with something wrong was already built into me. Check the panel, check the feed, go see for yourself. Rule or no rule, that instinct was always going to be there. It was part of the job. I grabbed my flashlight, hit the side door, and stepped out onto the Basin deck. The cold felt sharper than it had earlier. Not colder exactly, just narrower. Like all the air outside had been pushed into one thin band moving across the concrete. It hit my face hard enough to make my eyes water. The floodlights along the deck were bright and ugly, turning the railing white and throwing my shadow back at me in short, broken angles as I moved. The alarm was coming from the panel housing near the Basin, but I barely looked at it. My attention kept getting pulled toward the railing. That bothered me right away. A good part of security work is learning what your own body does before your brain finishes catching up. Sometimes you hear a gate rattle and your shoulders tense before you even place the sound. Sometimes you smell overheated wiring and start walking before you consciously register why. This felt like that, except worse, because my body wasn't reacting to danger. It was reacting to an invitation. I slowed down a few feet from the railing. The water below wasn't visible in any clean way from where I stood. I could see the floodlight glare breaking on the concrete lip and losing itself in the dark surface beneath, but the Basin itself held the light wrong. It didn't look like normal black water at night. Normal black water still gives something back. A weak shimmer, a shape, a little movement from the wind. This looked flat and deep and private, like it had no interest in reflecting anything above it unless it chose to. The alarm kept sounding. I took another step. Then I stopped. I didn't see a face. I didn't see a hand. Nothing rose up out of the water. If that had happened, I could have named it. I could have put it somewhere in my head, even if I didn't have a good explanation. What stopped me was worse, because it was simpler than that. I knew, with the kind of certainty that drops into your stomach before you have words for it, that if I leaned over and looked down long enough, something below that reflection would know I had done it. Not might. Would. I hate even saying that now because it sounds crazy, laid out plain like that. At the time, I tried to force it into better language, bad angle, nerves, first night jitters. Maybe the Blackfeet had gotten in my head and I was letting a dead camera and an alarm turn into something they weren't. I told myself all of that while I stood there, not moving. "Come on," I said. My voice sounded too small out there. The wind took it and flattened it. I kept my eyes on the railing instead of the water. That was the part that felt stupid in the moment. I was standing on a basin deck because an alarm had gone off, and I was refusing to look at the basin. It made no sense. If somebody had seen me from another camera, I would have looked like an idiot, halfway to doing my job and then freezing up for no reason. But I couldn't make myself take that last step. The alarm cut off, just like that. No sputter, no fade, no second signal. It stopped so clean it actually made me look up. I waited for the panel to throw something else, some follow-up fault, some pressure note, some explanation. Nothing came. The wind moved over the deck. The lights hummed. The basin stayed dark. I stood there another few seconds with my hand half raised, flashlight hanging loose in it, and tried to decide whether that made things better or worse. If the alarm had kept going, I could have called it a real issue. If the feed had come back with static or distortion, I could have logged a camera failure. If something obvious had broken, at least I'd have had a box to put it in. Instead, I had a black screen, an alarm that cleared itself, and the fact that I had been too afraid to look over a railing. I went back inside and checked the panel first. Everything read normal. No visible fault. No pressure warning still hanging on. Then I checked the monitor wall. The Basin 2 feed was back. Same bad angle as before. Same concrete lip and dark water. Nothing in frame that looked any different from the other basins except for the fact that I was now looking at it like it had done something to me. I opened the logbook and sat there with the pen over the page for a second. What was I supposed to write? 1:14 a.m. Basin 2 alarmed. Camera feed blacked out. Alarm self-cleared. Guard chose not to verify visually because he suddenly felt like looking into the water would be a mistake. I didn't write that. I put down the time. I noted the alarm and the feed interruption. I wrote that the panel returned to normal on its own. That was as close to the truth as I could make it, while still sounding like a man who wanted to keep his job. Then I sat back in the chair and looked at the Basin 2 feed again. I tried to make it mechanical in my head. Old plant, bad wiring, cold weather, moisture in a junction box, a pressure hiccup from a system not worth the town's budget to fully update. All of that was possible, probably more than possible. Places like Red Mesa ran on the kind of equipment that stayed in service 5 years longer than it should because replacing it cost money nobody wanted to spend. I could work with that explanation. I wanted to work with it. What stayed with me wasn't the alarm. It wasn't even the black camera feed. It was the simple, stupid fact that when I got to the railing, I had really believed something down there was waiting to know whether I looked. After the Basin 2 alarm, I kept moving through the shift the way you do when something happens too early and you don't want to give it more room in your head than it deserves. I stayed in the control room longer than I meant to. I checked the feeds again. I reread the last page in the logbook. I walked out to the gate and back. I told myself I was just getting familiar with the route. That was partly true. The other part was that I didn't feel like stepping out toward the basin side again, unless I had a reason I could write down afterward. The office clock rolled forward. The HVAC kicked on and off. Every now and then the pipes in the wall made that dull settling sound old buildings make when heat shifts through them. Nothing dramatic, just enough small noise to keep me from ever really forgetting I was alone. At some point after midnight, I stepped out of the office to start another round. The air had gotten drier, colder. Not mountain cold, not real deep winter cold, but the kind that found the gap at your collar and stayed there. I buttoned my jacket one notch higher and clipped the radio closer to my chest because the speaker on those things always sounded thinner in the open air. I was on the path between the office side and the lower service run when I heard my name, not shouted, not carried hard on the wind, just spoken at the exact volume where it sounded like somebody didn't need to yell because they already knew I'd hear it. "Brent?" I stopped so fast my boots scraped on the concrete. The voice had come from the direction of the lower pump house. That was clear enough. Everything else about it wasn't. It wasn't close enough to feel like someone was right behind me. It wasn't far enough away to blur out the shape of the word either. It landed right in that middle distance where you can picture a person standing in shadow with one hand on a railing, waiting for you to answer like nothing in the world is strange about the situation. My mouth opened before I thought about it. That reflex was already there. Somebody says your name at work, you answer. That's basic, especially on a night shift, especially at a place spread out enough that people have to call across distance. Then I remembered the second rule. If you hear your name from the lower pump house after midnight, don't answer and don't go down there alone. I shut my mouth and stood there listening. Nothing came after it. No second call. No, hey, no explanation. Just the low hum from the plant and the dry hiss of wind moving along the fence somewhere to my right. That silence was almost worse than if the voice had kept going. Because once a thing repeats itself, you can start sorting it. Worker, radio bleed, somebody messing with you. But one clean use of your name, then nothing, leaves you standing there doing the sorting yourself. I unclipped the radio and hit the side button. "Control, you got anybody down by lower intake?" I asked over channel 1. The radio hissed. Then a voice came back too fast. "Come down here." That was the moment the whole thing shifted for me. Not because the voice sounded monstrous. It didn't. That would have been easier. If it had growled or warped or done something obvious, I could have put the radio down and told myself equipment was bad or somebody was screwing around in a way too dumb to keep their job. What came back sounded wrong in a much smaller way. It sounded like an answer that had been waiting before I asked the question. That was what I couldn't get around. The voice didn't identify itself. It didn't say my name this time. It didn't use any radio shorthand. Just those 3 words, plain and close, in a tone that sounded more like somebody trying not to let impatience show than somebody actually calling in from a work site. I kept holding the radio up even after the speaker went dead again. My thumb was still against the transmit button. I remember looking down the slope toward the lower pump house and seeing the roof line, the weak security light, and the black space around it. Nothing moving, no figure by the door, no flashlight beam, no reason to go down there unless I decided I needed one. That part mattered. I could have gone. I thought about it, not because I wanted to prove anything, just because the job itself pushes you that way. Verify. Check. Don't sit on something if there might be a real person needing help or a real problem getting worse because you got spooked by a bad signal. But I didn't go. I wish I could tell you I made that choice because I was calm and smart and already putting the whole night together in my head. That isn't true. I didn't go because every part of me that had tightened at Basin 2 tightened again, and this time it came with a very clear thought attached to it. If I answered that voice on its terms, I'd be stepping into something instead of just checking it. So I stood there another few seconds, radio in hand, staring down toward the lower pump house like I could force a normal explanation to walk out of it. Nothing did. Finally, I lowered the radio, backed up 2 steps without meaning to, then turned and went back toward the office side. I told myself it could still be equipment, cross-channel noise, a transmission stepping over from somewhere else, maybe somebody from a different crew on the same band, maybe sound carrying odd down the slope and my tired brain filling in the shape of a voice where there wasn't one. I told myself all of that because the alternative was worse and because I still wanted the job to be a job. But I didn't answer when my name came the second time either, because there was a second time, not right away, maybe 15 minutes later, maybe 20. I was back inside, logging the radio call without putting too much weight on it when I heard it through the wall. Faint, not enough to make out from exactly where if I'd been hearing it fresh, but I knew what it was because my body knew first. Same small jolt, same tightening in my neck. Brent. I kept writing. That was an active choice. Small, stupid-looking from the outside, but active. I could have stopped. I could have gone to the door. I could have called back over the radio again. Instead, I finished the line I was writing, set the pen down, and stayed where I was. That didn't feel brave. It felt dirty. Like ignoring someone you maybe shouldn't ignore. Like letting your own caution outweigh basic decency. That bothered me almost as much as the voice itself. By the time 2:30 a.m. came around, I was already more tired than the hour deserved. Not sleepy, just worn thin around the edges from carrying too many explanations that didn't fit. I grabbed the flashlight and headed out for the west fence round, because the route board said 2:30 and because I needed the comfort of doing something on time. The west fence line looked different at night than it had during the walkthrough with Stan. In daylight, I'm sure it would have looked like exactly what it was. Fencing, hard ground, scrub brush, utility lights, the chlorine shed at the far end. At 2:30 a.m., it felt longer than the map in my head said it should be. The fence lights ran in a line that should have made the whole stretch easier to judge, but instead, they made the darkness between them feel measured and deliberate. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. I didn't say the first few out loud, just tracked them in my head while I walked. The gravel shifted under my boots. My flashlight beam stayed low, mostly on the path and the fence base, because there wasn't much point wasting it against the pole lights. 4, 5, 6. That matched the rule. 6 floodlights. I remember feeling a stupid little pulse of relief at that. Not because I believed the rule exactly. More because I wanted at least one thing that night to line up with what I'd been told and then stop there. 6 lights, fine, great. Walk the rest of the line, turn around, go back inside, finish the shift, get paid. I kept walking toward the chlorine shed. Then I looked up again, and there were 7. I stopped so hard, the flashlight beam jumped. The extra light wasn't dramatic. That's the part that made it worse. It didn't flare on out of nowhere. It wasn't red or flickering or hanging in the air. It was just there, set back in line with the others as if it had always belonged there, and I was the one having trouble with basic counting. I stood there and tried to make the ground hold still under me. 6. I had counted 6. I knew I had. But the moment the 7th light was in front of me, the earlier 6 got slippery in my head. Maybe I'd skipped one. Maybe the angle had hidden it until I got farther down. Excuses came fast after that because that's what your mind does when something small goes wrong. It tries to make the wrong thing your fault. I almost counted them again. That was the pull, not the light itself. The need to settle it, just count again, start over, be sure. I felt it so strongly it actually made me take a breath for it. Then I remembered the exact wording Stan had used. West fence at 2:30, 6 lights. If you see 7, turn back. So I did. I turned around without aiming my flashlight at the extra one. I kept my beam low on the gravel and the fence posts and walked back the way I'd come, trying not to speed up because speeding up would mean admitting I thought something was following me. What got to me wasn't seeing the seventh light once. It was the feeling, all the way back up that fence run, that it was still where it needed to be relative to me. Not behind me, not ahead of me. Just holding position at the edge of my awareness with the patience of something that didn't have to hurry. I never looked straight at it again. I don't know if it stayed there the whole time or if that was my head making a bad situation worse. I only know that when I got close enough to the office side for the other building lights to break up the line, the pressure in my shoulders eased a little in the exact way it does when you leave a room where someone's been standing too close behind you. Back in the control room, everything looked almost normal. That almost was getting expensive by then. The monitor feeds were all up, but they felt half a beat off. I can't explain that any better without making it sound like I knew more than I did. The camera on the service gate showed the gate. The Basin feed showed the Basin. The west fence feed showed the west fence. Nothing obvious was wrong in the pictures. They just didn't feel current in the way live video is supposed to feel current. Like, if I'd stepped outside and waved at one of them, the screen might have taken a second too long to admit I was there. The dark between buildings looked deeper now, too. Not darker exactly, deeper. Like the empty spaces on the site had gained more room inside them than the layout allowed. I sat down with the logbook open and stared at the page long enough that the lines started to blur together. Then I wrote down the round times. I wrote down the radio contact as equipment irregularity because I didn't have anything better to call it. I wrote down the west fence check without mentioning the seventh light because I knew how that looked on paper, and because some part of me still thought if I didn't commit that detail to ink, I might be able to get rid of it by daylight. That didn't work. By then, Red Mesa no longer felt like one place. It felt like the map on the board and the ground under my boots had started to disagree with each other, and I still had hours left to walk through whichever one turned out to be real. By then, I was handling the night one piece at a time, because that was the only way to keep moving through it. Basin 2 had been one thing. The lower pump house had been one thing. The west fence had been one thing. As long as I kept them separate, I could still pretend I was dealing with equipment, bad timing, maybe my own nerves. The trouble was, Red Mesa kept handing me the next problem before the last one had anywhere to go. The problem was that every time I got close to settling on one explanation, the plant gave me another problem shaped just wrong enough to break it. I left the control room again because there were still doors on the route that needed to be checked, and because sitting still had started to feel worse than moving. Once you stop trusting the feeds, the only thing left is your own feet. That was what I told myself. I took the inside corridor first, then the side run that cut toward the older section of the property. The closer I got to the filter gallery, the more the building felt separate from the rest of Red Mesa. Not abandoned, not condemned, just older in a way the others weren't. The concrete there held the cold longer. The windows were narrower. The outside light over the service side didn't spread much, so most of the wall sat in a dull yellow edge fade before the dark took it over. I checked the handle first. Locked. I shined the flashlight through the wired glass and saw the same thing I should have seen. A strip of hallway, painted block wall, old tile floor, no movement. The intercom box sat mounted on the inside wall farther down, cream-colored once, now yellowed with age. Same one Stan had glanced at and moved past. I should have just logged the door and kept going. I know that. What held me there was something small. One of those practical, work-shaped thoughts that gets you into trouble because it feels reasonable at the time. After everything else that night, I wanted one look at something that stayed where it belonged. One locked door, one empty hallway, one piece of the plant that looked exactly like it ought to. I was still standing there when the intercom clicked on. Not loud, just that dry little electrical pop before a speaker opens. I froze. At first, all I got was static. Thin, dirty static. Not movie static, not dramatic. Just the sound of an old speaker carrying current again after sitting quiet too long. It made the hair on my arms lift anyway. I kept staring through the wired glass, half expecting someone to come into view and make the whole thing ordinary. Nobody did. The static shifted once, like something on the other end had breathed too close to the mic. Then it spoke. "Brent," the voice said, using Walter's voice, "open the door." That was the worst moment of the night up to then, not because the voice was loud or strange, but because it wasn't. It sounded like Walter on a bad night. Not confused enough to be rambling, not clear enough to be fully himself. Just tired, turned around, asking for help with something small and immediate. A man standing in the wrong part of his own house, wanting someone to make the room make sense again. There wasn't anything theatrical in it. No echo, no dragged-out syllables, nothing trying to sound creepy. That made it hit harder. If it had sounded off by 10%, I could have fought it easier. If it had sounded too smooth, too flat, too dead, I could have pushed it away. Instead, it sounded close enough that my body moved before my head did. My hand tightened on the keys in my pocket. My chest went hot all at once. I took half a step toward the door before I caught myself. That was when Rule 4 came back to me so clean, it felt like Stan was standing over my shoulder. If the filter gallery intercom says the name of somebody you love, you leave and you lock the door behind you. I don't know why that last part mattered as much as it did. The door was already locked. I had checked it myself, but the rule had been specific, and by that point in the night, I had already learned the difference between hearing something and doing exactly what it told you not to ignore. "No," I said. My voice came out low and rough, like I didn't trust it either. The speaker crackled once, and for 1 second, I thought it was going to say more. "Ask again. Use a different line. Use my name the way Walter did when he was trying to sound patient and failing at it." Instead, the intercom went dead so suddenly the silence after it felt heavy. I moved then. Not fast. Fast would have been panic, and I wasn't ready to call it that yet. But I moved. I backed off the glass, turned, stepped to the exterior latch, checked it, then pulled once hard just to feel the lock hold. Only after that did I start back toward the control room. I kept expecting the voice to come through again behind me. Through the intercom, through the radio, from one of the side buildings, from anywhere. It didn't. That almost made it worse. The quiet felt deliberate by then, like the plant had figured out I'd heard enough. When I got back inside the control room, I went straight to the monitor wall. That was instinct, too. If hearing things could be written off, video could still pin something down, timestamps, movement in frame, the basics. I told myself that whatever had just happened, the feed would at least tell me where I'd been standing and for how long. Maybe I'd see someone on camera near the gallery. Maybe the office speaker had somehow bled into the wrong line. Maybe Nicole or Stan had forgotten to mention some old call forward issue tied into the building systems. It didn't have to make sense all the way. It just had to make enough sense to stand on. I found the exterior angle for the filter gallery and backed the feed up. The first thing that hit me was the time. It was off. Not broken looking. Just wrong enough that I felt it before I could prove it. I'd just been outside. I knew how long I'd stood at that door. The camera showed me arriving too soon and leaving too soon, like a piece from the middle had been cut out. I rolled it back again. Same thing. I switched to another angle that should have caught at least part of the wall. Empty. Not empty before and after. Empty straight through. Then I checked the office side feed, the system time, the panel event list for the intercom circuit. None of it lined up cleanly. No fault, no trigger, no record of the speaker opening at all. That was the part that finally got through to me. The systems weren't giving me reality back. They were giving me just enough to keep me from calling them broken. That was the part that finally got through to me. Not the voice itself, not even hearing Walter in the wrong place. It was the fact that every system I turned to for something solid gave me just enough to keep me from calling it broken and not enough to confirm what I knew had happened. That is a bad feeling in a workplace. It's worse than a visible problem. A visible problem is something you can report. A gate latch fails, a sensor throws a fault, a camera dies, a line pressure goes wrong. Fine, you call it in, you tag it, you work around it. But once the systems start preserving the wrong shape of the last 5 minutes, your options get thin fast. I sat there with the cursor blinking on the incident line and realized I no longer trusted the monitor wall to give me reality back. That cost me more than I understood at the time. Until then, even with the Basin 2 feed going black and the voice on the radio, part of me had still been working under the idea that the plant itself was stable, and I was the thing reacting badly inside it. The cameras, the logs, the panel data, those were supposed to be outside me, neutral. If I got rattled, they could still tell me what actually happened. Not anymore. I wrote down that the filter gallery intercom had come on unexpectedly. I wrote down that no source could be confirmed on review. That was the closest I could get without sounding like I needed to be pulled off shift. While I was writing, something metallic hit from somewhere outside the office side. One sharp sound, not a crash, more like a bar or latch taking weight and giving it back. I looked up. Nothing moved on the feeds. A second sound came from farther away, wrong enough that I couldn't place the direction. That was new too. Red Mesa had started to feel bad in pockets earlier. Now it felt like the distances were slipping. Sounds were arriving from angles the map in my head didn't support. Then the intake numbers on the board twitched. Not a full spike, not yet. Just enough movement to catch my eye because everything else on the panel was holding steady. The kind of tiny wrong reading a normal night would let you ignore for another 10 minutes. On that night, after the gallery, it felt like the plant clearing its throat. I checked the gate statuses. All normal. The panel settled again. I kept my hand near the desk edge without realizing I was doing it, like I might need to stand up fast. That was when it hit me that Red Mesa no longer felt divided into outside and inside the way it had when my shift started. At first, the bad parts had all been somewhere else. Basin 2, Lower Pump House, West Fence, places I went to, then came back from. Places I could mark on the route board and tell myself I was still returning to the same safe room in the middle. After the filter gallery, that line had started to move. Not because anything had forced its way into the control room. Nothing had. The door was still shut. The lights were still on. The desk, the log, the stale coffee smell, all of it was the same. But the room had stopped feeling like the point everything else led back to. It felt like the next place in line. And once that thought landed, I couldn't get rid of it. The only thing left that still felt like it belonged to my real life was the phone on the desk. After the filter gallery, I stopped pretending I wasn't keeping track of my phone every few minutes. I had left it face up on the desk beside the logbook, screen dark, volume up just enough that I'd hear it over the HVAC and the radio. I told myself that was normal. Walter was home alone. Of course I'd keep the phone close. I would have done that no matter what kind of shift I was on. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth anymore. The whole truth was that by then I had started watching the phone the way you watch a pot you don't trust on the stove. Not because it's doing anything yet, because you know if it does, you're already behind. I checked it again after the intake number settled back down. No new call, no text, no voicemail notification. I picked it up anyway and looked through the recent calls like something might have changed since the last time I looked 30 seconds earlier. Nothing. I set it down, picked it up again. That was the kind of night it had become. Walter wasn't the sort of man who called over every little thing. That was part of what made the slips harder on me. He could still go hours, sounding almost fine, then suddenly get turned around by something small and stupid. A light switch, a hallway, the TV remote. Once I came home and found him standing in the laundry room because he'd opened the wrong door and forgotten what he'd been looking for by the time the light came on. He'd laughed it off that time. I had too. Then later in the shower, I leaned one hand against the tile and stayed there longer than I meant to. That was how it worked with him. It wasn't big, dramatic scenes. It was little ordinary things breaking at the wrong angle. That was why the voice in the gallery had gotten to me the way it had. I told myself I should call, just to check, just to hear him answer and get one clean piece of reality back into the night. That was all. If he picked up and sounded normal enough, I could breathe again. If he didn't pick up, I'd know what kind of problem I had. So I called. It rang too long. Then voicemail. I hung up before the tone and stared at the screen like it had done something personal. I called again. This time it went to voicemail faster, and when I pulled the phone away from my ear, I saw I had a voicemail already sitting there from a few minutes earlier. I hadn't heard it come in. That made my stomach drop harder than I want to admit. I opened it right there at the desk. It wasn't even 10 seconds long. At first, all I got was room sound, a little rustle, a hollow, house-at-night kind of quiet. Then I heard Walter moving the phone wrong against his ear or shirt or whatever he'd done with it. Then his voice, not loud, not scared, just tired and confused in that way I knew too well. "I can't find the kitchen light," he said in Walter's voice. The message cut off after that. I just sat there. There are things you can talk yourself around if they stay big and vague. The big, vague stuff is easier. You can tell yourself you imagined it. You can tell yourself a tired brain reached for the most frightening version because it was tired. But that voicemail wasn't big or vague. It was small, specific, miserable in the most ordinary way possible. The kitchen light. That was exactly the kind of thing Walter would call about. Not because he didn't know where the switch was, because some nights the room would stop lining up right in his head, and a thing that belonged exactly where it had belonged for 20 years would feel new to him all over again. I played the message again. Same thing. Little rustle. Quiet. His voice. Then cut off. I checked the timestamp. It lined up too close to when I'd been at the filter gallery. I played it a third time and felt something inside me start to come apart in a slow, ugly way. Because now I had two choices, and both of them were bad. Either Walter had really called me from home and cut off before I could hear anything else, which meant he might actually be standing in that house alone, confused in the dark, needing help while I was 30 minutes away at a water treatment plant pretending I had a shift worth finishing. Or something in Red Mesa had found a way to reach right into the smallest, most ordinary fear I carried around with me and use it like a key. I didn't know which one was worse. I called the house line next. No answer. Called Walter's phone again. Voicemail. I stood up so fast the chair wheels clicked against the floor. For maybe 3 seconds, I was done. That was it. Shift over. Screw the job, screw the logbook, screw Red Mesa and every locked door on the property. If Walter was home alone and confused and trying to find the kitchen light, then I was getting in my truck and going home. That was my first real impulse. Then the radio stayed quiet. The control room stayed exactly as it was. The monitor wall glowed, the office light buzzed, and sitting right in the middle of all that ordinary equipment was the memory of the voice from the gallery saying my name in Walter's voice like the plant already knew this was where it needed to press. That was the part that hurt. Not fear, exactly. Conflict. A bad, tearing kind of conflict. Because if Walter needed me, leaving was the only decent thing. And if Red Mesa wanted me moving on instinct, then bolting out into the dark because I'd heard my father's voice was exactly the kind of thing that would finish whatever this night had been trying to set up since Basin 2. I put both hands on the desk and lowered my head for a second. I remember staring at the wood grain laminate and the coffee ring beside the keyboard and thinking, stupidly, how cheap the desk looked to be carrying that kind of decision on it. Then I called one more number. My neighbor 2 houses over. The one who'd told me twice already that if Walter ever got turned around bad while I was gone, I could call her first before I panicked. No answer. That didn't help. I listened to the voicemail again anyway, as if I might hear a clue in it the fourth time that I hadn't heard the first three. A TV in the background, a faucet, anything that would make it cleaner. All I got was Walter sounding like Walter. That was when I understood the real shape of the problem. It didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to sound exactly like him for a full minute, or tell some impossible story, or know every detail of my life. It only needed enough to get ahead of the part of me that sorted facts. Enough to hit the reflex first. Enough to make me move before I decided whether moving was a mistake. That was worse than if it had sounded wrong. If it had been too polished, too theatrical, too clean, I could have pushed back. But this was small and ordinary and worn at the edges, just like Walter on a rough night. That was what made it unbearable. I set the phone down hard enough to make the pens jump in the tray. "You're not him," I said. I wasn't even sure who I was saying it to. The voicemail, the plant, the empty room. Maybe myself. The words sounded thin once they were out. Not brave, not convincing, just something I needed to hear in my own voice because the other one was getting too much room. I didn't leave. I need to be honest about that. I didn't leave because I had suddenly become certain Walter was safe. I wasn't certain of anything. I stayed because by then I knew enough to understand that if I started moving through Red Mesa on the strength of Walter's voice alone, I was giving the night exactly what it wanted from me. That knowledge didn't make the choice easier. It made it uglier. I stood there with my phone in my hand and felt for the first time that night something worse than fear. I felt ashamed. Ashamed that I was hesitating. Ashamed that part of me needed proof before running to my father. Ashamed that another part of me thought proof might be the trap. That was the point where Red Mesa stopped feeling like a bad place to work nights. It became the place where I found out something didn't have to sound exactly like Walter to get past my guard. It just had to sound close enough to make me feel bad for hesitating. I sat there after that with the phone still in my hand and the voicemail screen gone dark again. And for the first time all night, I stopped treating each thing that happened like it could stay separate from the rest. Up to then, that was what I'd been doing. Basin 2 had been its own problem. The voice from the lower pump house had been its own problem. The seventh light had been its own problem. The intercom had been its own problem. Walter's voicemail had been its own problem. That was how I'd stayed functional. Break it apart. Handle what's in front of you. Don't start stitching things together unless you absolutely have to. But by then, I had to. Because if I didn't, I was going to keep making the same mistake over and over. I was going to keep thinking the thing at Red Mesa was just moving around the plant, showing up in different places, picking different ways to get under my skin. That wasn't what it was doing. It was doing one thing. It was asking, not all at once, not in some big, obvious way, just over and over in whatever form fit the part of the plant it had access to. Basin 2 had asked me to look. The lower pump house had asked me to answer. The extra light at the west fence had asked me to count again. The intercom had asked me to open the door. The voicemail had asked me to trust what I was hearing fast enough that I'd move before I thought. That was the pattern. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the monitor wall again, but I wasn't really looking at the feeds anymore. I was looking past them, back through the whole shift, laying each part next to the next one and seeing where they matched. Basin 2 wasn't just a basin with a bad alarm and a black camera. It was a place designed to make a person do the most ordinary thing in the world at a job like that. Walk over, lean down, check with your own eyes, verify the problem. The danger hadn't been the water by itself. The danger had been me letting the water know I had agreed to see it. The lower pump house wasn't just where a voice came from. It was where my name got used the way a wrench gets used, as a tool. The question there was never, is someone down there? The real question was, will you answer if something down there knows how to sound like it belongs in your night? The seventh light wasn't just a visual glitch. That one took me a minute. I kept wanting to reduce it to bad geometry or bad nerves, because on the surface it was the easiest one to laugh off. But it fit too clean once I saw the shape of the rest. The point of the extra light wasn't the light, it was the pull to settle it. Count again. Be sure. Give your attention back to the wrong thing until it stopped being wrong and started being accepted. The filter gallery intercom hit hardest when I laid it in that line, because by then it wasn't just one weird rule anymore. It was the clearest example of what the whole list had been trying to stop. Not a haunting, not random weirdness, an approach, an attempt, something using the systems of the plant the way a person uses a hallway, looking for the right angle into you. Not enough to overpower you, just enough to be let through. That was what finally clicked for me. If the point had only been fear, the rules would have sounded different. Stay away from this. Don't go there. Run if you see that. But that wasn't the list Stan gave me. Every rule was about refusing contact. Don't look. Don't answer. Don't count again. Leave. Lock the door. Don't open it. That was when the last rule moved into place too. The control room door. I looked at it from the desk and felt something cold slide through me that had nothing to do with the air in the building. Because the door had been there the whole night, same as the desk and the monitors and the cheap chair and the coffee stain. But now it looked different. Not because the door itself had changed, because I finally understood what it was for. It wasn't just a door on a municipal office, it was a threshold. That sounds bigger than I mean it to. I don't mean threshold in some mystical way. I mean exactly what it is in the most practical sense. A line between outside and inside. Between the part of the plant that still belonged to routes and pipes and cameras and the last little patch of space I was still trying to believe belonged to me. And that was what the list had really been about all along. Not, watch out for spooky stuff. Not, there's something bad here. It was this, don't give it away in. Not by being brave, not by being curious, not by being decent, not by trying to be sure. That was the ugly part. The rules weren't there to stop panic or stupidity. They were there to stop the kinds of things a person does without thinking. Checking, answering, helping, trying to be sure before you act. All the decent, ordinary reflexes the job had trained into me were the same ones this night kept reaching for. Look down and verify. Answer when called. Double-check what doesn't make sense. Open the door for somebody who sounds lost. Go when your father sounds like he needs you. That was why the list felt so wrong when Stan gave it to me. It wasn't asking me to be smarter than the plant. It was asking me to be colder than my own instincts. I finally understood the rules weren't there to keep me away from Red Mesa. They were there to keep something inside it from sounding enough like home to get invited in. Once that thought landed, a bunch of smaller things from earlier in the night changed shape too. Stan's face when he looked at Basin too. The way he never lingered on the lower pump house. The way he gave me the list with no drama, like saying too much around it might count for something too. Even the times made more sense now. After 1:10 a.m., at 2:30 a.m., at 3:17 a.m., not all night, not whenever. Specific windows. Like there were certain parts of the shift when whatever was wrong at Red Mesa had an easier way through. I didn't need a full history to know that list had been earned. Somebody before me had looked. Somebody before me had answered. Somebody before me had counted again or opened the wrong door or tried to help the wrong voice. That was enough. I didn't need names. I didn't need an old incident report. I didn't need a legend about what happened at Red Mesa years earlier. In a way, all of that would have made it easier, because then I could have turned the night into a story with edges, a beginning, a cause, a type of thing. What I had instead was worse and cleaner. A set of rules that made no sense until they suddenly made exactly one kind of sense. It didn't come closer when I ran. It came closer when I answered. I said that in my head before I even realized I'd formed the sentence. And once it was there, it fit everything too well to push away. Basin 2 hadn't gotten worse when I backed off the railing. The lower pump house hadn't come after me because I didn't answer it. The seventh light had stayed at the edge of things because I turned back without giving it more. The filter gallery hadn't pushed past the locked door because I left instead of standing there to prove something. The voicemail and Walter's voice hurt because they got closer to what might work on me, not because they had more power in some simple physical sense. That was the real escalation. It wasn't getting closer in any simple way. It was getting more accurate about where to press. That realization didn't make me feel smarter. It made me feel trapped in a different way. Because once you know the thing coming at you depends on your cooperation, even your smallest reactions start to feel dangerous. Every glance, every answer, every reach for a doorknob, even self-protection gets ugly because you stop trusting the best parts of yourself. Helpfulness, loyalty, the need to confirm what's real before you act. All of it starts looking like a loose wire somebody else can use. I looked down at the logbook on the desk and saw how stupid it all looked on paper. Alarm, radio irregularity, perimeter discrepancy, intercom activation, unconfirmed audio. That wasn't the night. That was just the version of it I could write down without sounding out of my mind. The real version was this. Something in Red Mesa didn't need to force itself through the plant. It just needed me to do one ordinary human thing at the wrong time. And if I did, I had a feeling the rest would happen fast. That was all the truth I got, and all the truth I needed. Not where it came from, not what it was called, not how long it had been there, just what it wanted. And by then, with 3:17 a.m. still ahead of me and the control room suddenly feeling less like shelter and more like the last locked place on a narrowing map, that was already plenty. By the time the clock in the control room rolled past 3 a.m., I had stopped thinking in terms of finishing the shift. That had been the goal earlier. Get through the night, keep the rounds tight, don't let the place get into your head. By then it was simpler than that. Stay inside the room. Don't do anything stupid because it sounds decent in the moment. Make it to daylight if daylight still meant anything. I checked my phone one more time. No new call, no new voicemail. The screen lit my hand and the desk and not much else. I set it back down face up beside the logbook and watched the monitor wall without trusting it. Every feed was still there. Basin 2, west fence, lower pump house, filter gallery, service gate. Nothing in any of them looked dramatic. That was part of what made the whole thing so bad. Red Mesa kept offering me pictures that looked almost normal and asking me to live inside that almost. At 3:17 a.m., the intake number jumped, not a flicker. Not the little twitch I had seen earlier. A real jump, enough to pull my eyes straight to the panel. The line climbed while every gate on the board still read closed. Green indicators all the way down. Closed, closed, closed. The intake kept rising anyway. My hands went cold first. That was what I noticed. Not fear in some big clear way. Just my hands. Rule 5. If intake flow rises at 3:17 while every gate still reads closed, stay in the control room and don't open the door for anyone. I got out of the chair and crossed to the door before I realized I was doing it. Not to open it, just to make sure it was shut all the way. I checked the latch. Then I checked the deadbolt above it. Then I looked through the narrow wired glass panel and saw nothing but the dim wash of exterior light and the empty concrete outside. The intake climbed a little more. Then something knocked. Not hard, just one measured hit against the metal. Enough to tell me exactly where the sound had come from and exactly how thin that door suddenly felt. I stood there with one hand still near the lock and every muscle in my back pulled tight. The second knock came a few seconds later. Same patient wait. No pounding, no panic, just somebody who expected that if they waited long enough, the person inside would do what people always do and open up. Then I heard my father's voice on the other side of the door. "Brent," my father's voice said through the door, "open up." Everything in me moved toward that voice at once. That's the only honest way to put it. Not because I believed it cleanly, I didn't, not anymore. But belief wasn't really the point by then. It sounded enough like Walter, tired and turned around and needing one simple thing, that the part of me built to answer him jumped before the rest of me could catch hold of it. I could hear the shape of him in it, the age in it, the little worn-down breath between words. Nothing dramatic, nothing pushed. Just Walter at the wrong side of a closed door. The intake number climbed again. I looked at the panel, then back at the door. That was the trap right there. Not something trying to force its way in. Something asking me to let it in while everything around me looked wrong enough to make that feel reasonable. If I opened the door because the panel was going bad, that counted. If I opened it because Walter sounded lost, that was worse. My hand had already drifted halfway toward the latch before I caught it and pulled it back. I didn't answer. The silence after that felt worse than the voice. I could hear my own breathing. The HVAC. A thin electrical buzz from one of the monitors. And beneath all of it, not from outside exactly, but not from inside me either, the sense that something had leaned all its weight against that moment and was waiting to see if I'd hold. The voice came again, softer this time, and that nearly broke me. Not because it said anything clever, because it didn't. It just sounded tired. It sounded like a man who needed help finding his way from one room to another. I shut my eyes for 1 second and saw Walter standing in our kitchen in his socks, looking at the wrong wall for the switch. Saw him blinking at the dark like he'd misplaced a piece of his own house. That was enough to make my throat lock up, but I still didn't answer. I stepped back from the door instead. 1 step, then another. I kept my eyes on it the whole time, like if I looked away, the handle might move on its own. The intake number held high for a few more seconds that felt stretched thin and ugly. Then, the east window beside the monitor wall started to fog. I stared at it. The glass clouded from the edges in, pale at first, then milky enough that the dark outside disappeared behind it. The door stayed shut. The voice didn't speak again. The intake held. Then, little by little, the fog on the window thinned. It cleared as quietly as it had come. At the same time, the panel readings settled. The intake dropped back into normal range. Every gate still showed closed. Nothing on the monitor wall explained any of it. I stayed where I was for a long time after that, standing in the middle of the control room with my phone on the desk, the logbook open, and the door still shut. I didn't trust the quiet. I didn't trust the panel. I didn't trust the monitors. But I trusted the fact that I was still inside the room and the room was still closed. Daylight came slow and flat. By sunrise, Red Mesa looked like what it had always pretended to be. A small water treatment plant outside Grand Junction. Concrete, railings, chain-link fence, low buildings, scrubland beyond the property line. Nothing about it in the morning light matched what it had been overnight, and that made me hate it more than if the place had still looked wrong. I quit Red Mesa at sunrise. I told them I wasn't coming back for another shift. I didn't give Nicole Ramsey a story. I didn't try to make the log say more than it could hold. I took my keys, my phone, the cold coffee smell out of my jacket, and I left. What stayed took longer. Walter was alive when I got home. He was at the kitchen table, wearing the same flannel shirt from the day before, looking half embarrassed because he'd forgotten where he'd put the cereal bowls. The kitchen light worked fine. That should have settled something in me. It didn't. Ever since that night, if I hear my name from the other side of a dark room, I wait for it to come a second time. Even when it sounds like Walter, especially then. That's the part Red Mesa took from me. Not sleep, not the job, that first clean instinct to answer.